I primarily study axis deer. I'm gonna talk about both whitetail and axis and what impacts they might have on the vegetative communities in the riparian zones, but primarily axis deer because it is what I study. So if I was asked to kind of give a little bit about some of the exclosures that we have on the Texas Tech University campus in Junction. So if you haven't been there or haven't seen them, a few years ago, we built some rather large exclosures. There's 6 of them now on campus that are meant for long-term study of what kind of impacts are we going to see with axis deer and whitetail, and can we do some experimental techniques to see if we can alter and influence vegetative communities. So all 6 of these were built in the riparian zone specifically. If you've never seen it, this one in particular is rather impressive because it's 500 feet by 500 feet. It's one of the largest exclosures I've ever seen. These were originally built in February 2018. This one was built earlier. It's about 8 years earlier than that, so it has quite a bit of change. They were all wiped out by the flooding in 2018. If you remember that, when the Llano River flooded about 30 feet, the water line was roughly about this line, and then further to the west side of the river too. So all of these exclosures were under about 20 feet of water at one point. They were then subsequently rebuilt in February 2019, and now we're looking at doing some very long-term studies. These are meant to be permanent on the campus, that we will see for decades kind of what impact both axis and whitetail are having. So first off, we need to look at what is the difference between axis and whitetail. What impacts are one species going to have, what's the other species going to have, and kind of the overlap, and to see, you know, if we would remove axis, okay, where can we potentially see some bounce back of certain certain riparian characteristics and where they're most having their impacts. So in the strictest sense of the term, axis deer and whitetail are not perfect competitors. They do not overlap perfectly. They do to some extent. Whitetail are what we would call a browser. They're going after the forbs, flowering plants, and woody trees, shrubs, other species. Axis deer are what we would term an intermediate feeder instead. They consume just about everything. So they do also go into the forbs and trees. But a large portion of their diet is grass. So if we get out of the very strict, you know, perfect overlap competition, axis and whitetail do have some level of overlap. Forbs and trees, and depending on certain years where we're seeing certain drought conditions, and availability of these different vegetative groups, we do have circumstances where axis and whitetail do eat all the forbs and trees out, get rid of all that browse, and when that happens, axis just switch their diet to grass. Whitetail can't digest grass in any significant amount, so they start having some very significant problems when we have years where the riparian zone doesn't necessarily provide as much as is needed to satisfy the requirements of both species. That being said, if you look at this figure, you know, some of the other questions I get is, okay, if axis deer aren't perfectly competed with whitetail, are they competing with other things that we have on the landscape? And to some extent, yes. In cattle, not really. But if we start looking at sheep and goats, axis are a pretty good competitor with sheep and goats. And really in terms of, when axis are competing with whitetail for the available forbs and trees, and then, kind of direct competition with sheep and goats, axis really are they're socially dominant to all these species. They're physically larger, they're more aggressive. So they actually push all these species off of high quality sites, and potentially impacting, not only the vegetative communities, but also the species that are relying on those, not only wildlife, but also livestock. So if we look at axis specifically, there hasn't been a whole lot of study on what specific vegetation species axis consume. We know a little bit from some studies back in the 80s, but there really hasn't been like a true bite study or a true, what exactly are they eating. We have some rough ideas. So diet, like I said, diet consists of basically what is available. They eat anything. A large portion of it is grass, and especially at certain times of the year, particularly winter, when things like Texas winter grass is coming up. That is a large portion of their diet at that time of the year. They do go primarily quality over quantity, which is a pretty standard herbivore response. But that does play into certain things, like they will go for seed heads off grass that contain a lot of energy that when they're seeding out, versus some other species. So there could potentially be impacting the ability to seed. Some of the preferred species we do know from some of those studies back in the 80s, Texas wintergrass, buffalo grass, the grama species, bluestem species, a lot of our native species, which is, when you consider that axis are an introduced invasive species, when they start heavily impacting our native vegetation, that a lot of, some of the grasses here, the whitetail aren't really relying on, but we use them a lot for livestock. So if axis are potentially impacting those particular species, it has a lot of impacts on livestock and some other things I'll go into later. So for example, this is one of our exclosures. It was on a private property, a high fence hunting ranch, so controlled. No livestock present on the ranch. The only large herbivores are whitetail and axis. So if we look at this, a bunch of this is Texas wintergrass. There's a ton of other grass species mixed in here. But if we look at the inside of the exclosure versus the inside is all seeded out about 18 to 24 inches tall. The grass outside, very few seed heads, about 3 to 6 inches tall. All of that impact, because we know there's no other livestock there, we know that grass impact is from axis. So just in this, one snapshot, we can see a significant impact over what they have to biomass, and then we'll get into some of the other characteristics of ground cover and below ground cover that axis impact. They will consume very unpalatable species if everything else is gone. There's no other source of food available. I have seen axis consume, and then I've also found bite marks on common horehound. Common horehound has some nutritional value, but it is very unpalatable. So for axis to go and eat that, but I've seen them eat thistle heads that are still rough and pointed. So that can't be very comfortable to eat. I've seen them strip mesquite through thorns. So they eat just about anything if needed to. So all that being said, what about axis habitat? There's a very strong overlap with riparian habitats. with access. They need that water at least once per day. And also in India, where they're from, they are a riparian species. So just, via their native biology and ecology, they are capable of having very significant impacts on these sensitive riparian habitats that, both Kyle and Dan have talked about. They prefer grassland shrubland mix, so both they have that food source with available cover, but they also use bottomland forests and can have considerable impacts on those. And as one of our other components of my research, we've looked at estimating densities, and we did this for both whitetail and axis via spotlight surveys. So I can't give you the specifics here because the paper is actually in review right now. So once that is available, we hope to do another presentation with our collaborators at Hill Country Alliance. But comparably, whitetail and axis, whitetail density is only 16% higher than axis. They're roughly equal. And for axis that have only been here approximately 90 years now, to be roughly as abundant as our native species is concerning. There's a lot of reproductive biology that plays into axis that allowed them to grow, but it's very concerning that these two species are roughly equal. And once we combine these densities, you start looking at, what is the total density of deer and what really is the carrying capacity of the riparian habitats. And the combined density is exceptionally high for deer without having some significant ecological impacts. And if we just look at some of we did some estimates for habitat specifics, and really some of these names are kind of abstract. They're not overly important. But if you look at the riparian habitats, which, shrublands and barrens, mixed hardwood, mixed forest, grasslands, and wetlands, that covers the spectrum of habitat down there in the riparian zones, and the three highest estimated densities were all in those three. The upland habitats all had composed the five lowest. So just via how abundant they are, how dense they are in riparian habitats, axis can have significant impacts. And then we also know that whitetail are really dense in those areas too, because that's the best habitat. You start getting into the drier upland conditions, there's not as much available food for whitetail. These high densities of both species in the riparian zones can have some really significant impacts. So what really are those impacts? This was an exclosure that was on the state park in Junction, Southland River State Park. If you look outside the exclosure, which is in the foreground and inside's in the background, you can see that there is obviously quite the compositional change here. Outside is pretty much bare ground. Inside is a lot of grasses, forbs, and some other species. What is very interesting in this particular exclosure is we built this exclosure on purpose in a giant frostweed patch. There was nothing growing in that patch other than frostweed and horehound. That was the only, and then pecans as the tree structure. But that was the only ground cover was frostweed and horehound, neither of which are palatable. Once we excluded deer from this, we found a huge emergence of a ton of different grasses, which tells us that, within those monocultures of frostweed and horehound, there was actually a lot of seed in the seed bank in the soil of very valuable sources. So as soon as we excluded deer from being able to consume those newly sprouted grass species from as soon as they came up, we excluded deer. They were able to come back, and then they actually pushed out the non-palatable forbs. So, by excluding deer here, we changed the composition of the community just by taking out deer, and primarily by removing axis, since they're the impacts on grass. So they do have significant impacts on those native grasses. Removal of those palatable and nutritionally valuable species that we use for livestock and for whitetail and other wildlife. But they also, like I said, they can drastically change the ground cover. This exclosure, like I said, is one of the best examples for it. When you look at bare ground outside the exclosure with a little bit of horehound down here, a little bit of frostweed spread in, and then you take out axis and whitetail, and you get a big grass patch full of native grasses, high nutritionally valuable species. So they can have quite an impact just on the above ground cover and composition. Additionally, they are known, along with whitetail here, to prevent and slow regeneration of our large hardwoods. So we're specifically talking pecan and live oak here, a little bit of cedar elm and some other large hardwoods. But with pecan and live oak, in a lot of places where the two species are very dense, are very abundant, if you actually go and look for young seedlings and saplings of particularly pecan and live oak, you'll be very hard pressed to find them. And if you do find them, protect them, because they will get hit very, very quickly. As their first year basically into the growth here, they will get browsed on. And we've seen a shift where pretty much all of the pecans and live oaks that are left are just getting older, and we're not really getting regeneration of younger seedlings and saplings into the population, because our very high densities of axis and whitetail are hitting those before they're ever allowed to grow. So some other examples I kind of wanted to show you. These are two other exclosures. This is another on that first ranch that I talked about that doesn't have any livestock. This ranch rotates livestock on occasionally, but I don't believe there was any before this picture was taken. So in both cases, this really is only a year worth of change. And from when these pictures were taken, this fence was only up for a year. So there's considerably more biomass of particularly of grasses when we look inside the exclosures here versus outside. And there are additional impacts of trampling, and I'll go over that next. But access, because of the
we got about 30 seconds to a minute before we do.
Okay.
Sorry.
No problem. But if you see this, one of the other I said those seed heads, if we take out axis, these areas could be sources of seed for other native species that are being hit outside. So the last thing I kind of want to talk is axes do have a considerable impacts on soil, erosion and compaction via their trailing, removal of stabilizing plants, remove those large underground root structures. And kind of the last thing I'll leave you with is this video. I want you to pay attention to this guy right here. Pay attention to his nose. He'll do it here in a second. It's hard to see, but if you look at this right here, that is a clump of root that he just pulled out an entire clump of grass by the roots over through an exclosure fence. So not only are they impacting the above ground structure and composition, they are now impacting that below ground structure that, you know, Kyle mentioned earlier, that are stabilizing riparian areas. So, you know, via their method of eating, they can have a significant impact on structure to both above and below ground. With that, since I'm out of time,